Welcome to Hospitality Talks. My name is Sam-Erik Ruttmann, and I'm with my co-host Abid Butt.
Hi,
I-
Sam.
Hello, Abid, and I'm absolutely delighted to have this particular episode. It's so timely. It's on everybody's mind at the moment. When we made the announcement that we were going to talk about resiliency, this was sort of got a lot of emotions involved because I think we are living in such a unbelievable time in our lives where we can learn something every day from people who are experienced before, and also we can learn from experts who are having providing consultancy companies about resiliency and how to deal with these critical times before we get on the other side of the crisis. So Abid, I have to ask you, how are you doing? How are you coping?
Very, very good, very good. I'm very excited that we have two wonderful guest speakers on our panel today. So, if you don't mind, Sam, let's get started. It is a little late for them, so, and by the time our session ends, it'll be much later. So, uh,
Abid,
uh,
Abid, may I just say hello to the viewers are coming because I think they will love that we say hello to them. I just say a quick hello.
yes, yes, by all means.
Okay, all the LinkedIn viewers, welcome. Thank you for joining our broadcast. If you just put your name and or where you're viewing from, we'd like to share this with our guests where you are joining us from, and give us a thumbs up or any social currency that we will really greatly appreciate. Also, all the Facebook viewers, warm welcome. Please say hello also to us that you are watching us live, and then on YouTube, warm welcome also. Please give us a big hug or say something nice. We know that you are with us. I see already people joining in, and I think I want to give a special shout out to someone who has been very excited to join us. It's Dr. Leif Tengström in Finland. So I will address his very interesting comment in a moment. So over to you, Abid, and please introduce our guest.
Superb, superb. I'm glad that a lot of people are joining live. We really appreciate it. Would love your questions because, as Sam said, it is a very relevant topic. Though I must confess, to discuss leadership in detail is going to take far more than possibly an hour that we have allocated with two of our guests. Leadership has evolved over a long period of time, but our guests not only have done a lot of work in multiple different industries, but they have been involved in hospitality for a little while. So some of the insights, hopefully, we will hear about that are unique to lodging sector and hospitality sector. So without any further ado, let me bring in Dr. Alison Eyring. She is the CEO of Organization Solution. Alison, welcome to Hospitality Talk.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Superb. Our second guest is Corinne Williams, who is Senior Vice President for Leader Services, also with Organization Solutions. Corinne, welcome to Hospitality Talks.
Thank you. Nice to be here too.
Well, thank you both for taking the time. As Sam has mentioned, several folks have joined, so hopefully we will get a lot of great comments. If you don't mind, let's start with the concept of leadership. You know, the management principles started way back when with Peter Drucker, but since then it has evolved. It has evolved to leadership. Within the leadership discussions, there have been several theories that have come out and kind of faded away. So I'm going to be a bit controversial to start out with. And Alison, if you don't mind, I'll throw this your way. Is it really that these principles are a lot different, or is it just that it's a sort of a fad that after a while goes away?
Well, I'm not sure how best to answer that. We as an organization think of leadership as driving collective effort to succeed. And so if leadership is driving collective effort to succeed, then the context within which we lead does change. So what we do, how we do changes as the communities within which we operate change, the context changes. We know that your industry is certainly going through a lot of change. Now is a very different time. So the leadership behaviors that might allow you to be collectively successful might look different. And we don't really differentiate. We don't get into views of, is it management or leadership? Because, leadership is driving collective effort to succeed. You could be an individual contributor and be a leader. You could be a CEO and not be a leader, right? Whereas a manager is an appointed position that has a formal authority given by the organization to make decisions that put the organization at risk and causes them to use the resources. So, we need managers and we need leaders. We need lots of them.
I think that's a very good distinction, that managers are appointed. Now, the old cliche of leaders are born, does that still hold true?
Great question. It turns out that there's actually been research that has looked at genetic influences on leadership. And there is a genetic component of leadership. But, Corinne, correct me if I'm wrong. My memory is that it's less than 50%, or it's like 30%, or I can't remember what the percentage is, but it's both. So there are certain things that we're born with that might stretch or not stretch as we grow up. And then there's other things that we learn. We learn how to do. We learn how to become managers. We learn how to give feedback. We learn to do those things. Introverts learn to behave like extroverts, right? So it's a little bit of both.
Well, typically, isn't it that human beings are very complex creatures to begin with? And typically, we always have a work phase and a social phase, if you would. And sometimes they could be at odds, because the organizational cultures might demand a different behavior than you would when you have a beer in your hand or a glass of wine sitting amongst your friends. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that a good example is that we learn how to behave in a way that the environment requires us to do. And so we might naturally, introversion or extroversion is a great example. If you're a GM of a hotel and you're introverted, you have to expend a little bit of extra energy because you are out in the limelight all the time. You're managing your relationships with owners, you're managing customers, you have all these external things. And so that might not be the most natural, and it might actually you might be very tired from all those interactions. Whereas if you're very extroverted, that might just energize you, right? And so I don't know if I call that the work and the personal. I just think that we have to always stretch ourselves to be effective in the environment based on what the environment demands of it. And sometimes it leverages our strengths and sometimes it doesn't. But the nice thing about humans is that we can change and we can adapt our behavior. And sometimes we can behave in a very social way, and sometimes we may be very quiet or reserved.
I think it's a great example of a paradox that leaders find themselves managing all the time. So you need to be yourself enough, but you also have a position and you have to put a face on sometimes. And, a crisis is a great example of that, where you have to be both at the same time. You have to be real and authentic with the challenges you're going through, but at the same time, you have to be leading your people. So you're managing that closeness and that distance all the time. Nobody said leadership was easy, but certainly it's one where you are constantly working that fine line between what is enough.
So what would define in some of the traits and attributes that would make successful leaders? I was reading an article, a little bit of a digression. In the article talked about that some of the stubborn kids growing up might turn out to be fabulous leaders in when they grow up and go in the business world. Now, I will never tell our son that, but there might be some truth to it, because recently some emails were released from Steve Jobs, and Jobs, as a wonderful business person and as creative and innovative as he was, the rumors are that he was somewhat difficult to work with. Any thoughts on that, Corinne?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, because when we work with leaders, we often think about what are the kinds of leaders that drive growth for organizations. So as Alison said, there are different leaders that are successful and maybe in different situations, but certainly leaders who drive growth and transformation for their organizations are different. And and we see them do three different things. We see them help the organization perform for today whilst building the capabilities that are going to enable transformation for tomorrow. And whilst they're doing these two things, they also have to be energizing their people. So building the right talent, building the right relationships, keeping an eye on the external market. So this is actually not necessarily the very nice person who is, really easy to get on with and is everybody's friend. That sometimes they're a bit like the sand and the oyster and can be a little bit disruptive. Because in order to do that, they need to be able to be enough disruptive, like not too disruptive that they get kicked out of the organization, but just enough so that they can push the organization forward.
So is it that the individuals need to be pushing the envelope at all time to make sure that the organizations grow and flourish, or is it that they need to conform?
Both at the same time. They need to conform enough so that they are building that strength, that relationship, that network. They're seen as somebody who can get things done in the context. And again, the context of a hotel or a property would be very different than potentially if they were working within a manufacturing environment. But innovation, experimentation, and thinking about how is the organization adapting is a really important role of a leader. And of thinking about how is the organization going to look in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, and pushing towards that. And sometimes that's hard because you might, especially in more traditional organizations, you might come across a bit of reticence and inertia against change.
Yeah, I always like to think also about the sort of the culture and the person. If the person is too agreeable and they're too conforming, they might fit in and make everyone comfortable around them, but they'll also not be capable of pushing for newness and change. And one of the challenges when we work with organizations where they have a culture, what I call terminal politeness. Everyone is so overly polite and so unwilling to ruffle feathers that what they find eventually is that they're incapable of changing. And so we really do need that tension. We can disagree without being disagreeable, but we have to have leaders who can push others. And in the way that the environment's changing now ever more quickly, we probably need leaders to push people more outside of their comfort zone. And so I think that's going to be very painful for many organizations.
This is always a challenge, quite candidly, for people as we grow through the organization and assume bigger and better roles. Some of these attributes are sort of learning on the job, if you would. It's not something that you read a manual and it tells you, well, do number 1, number 2, number 3, and you develop a style that works for you and works for the organization. How do you keep a check on whether that style is still relevant, or do you need to pivot?
That's such a great question, Abid. It's so interesting because I really think about your industry and I think about sort of the quintessential GM. She's always a refined person, has typically been in the industry a long time, has moved around. They're just has like a river that molds the banks, and then the bank shapes the river. It's like the person becomes that organization or those organizations, and vice versa. And I think that there's a tendency in that industry and many industries to become more internally focused. And I should say that with a little bit of caution, because I think that the people in your industry are very customer or guest focused, but often become very enamored and very focused on how we do things, because that's actually one of the key things for success. So I do see that that's really tough. And I just encourage leaders in all industries to always invest in looking outside. I'm not saying go look for jobs outside. I'm just saying invest in relationships with people outside of your industry, those relationships are very important because they challenge your worldview and they cause you to see outside of that comfort. And I believe that discomfort and that confrontation can kind of keep us on our edge and keep us growing and changing.
That's sorry, go ahead, Corinne.
I was going to add to that. I mean, I think there is a benefit and a risk in settling into a style of leadership because, as we've talked about, the challenges change, and therefore what you need to be doing and how you need to be leading changes, as well as what is important at each leadership level. So as you get more senior, the challenges get more complex. They require more integration of more people. You're working with a larger ecosystem. So what we see with really successful leaders is they are always learning. They are always looking for things that they can be changing and adapting. And we work closely with a number of leaders through our global coaching network who really focus on what is it that I need to prioritize in order to meet the next challenges of the role I'm in or the role I'm wanting to grow into. And that's really important. I think all leaders should be doing that and encouraging that culture within their organization.
Now, some of these attributes also vary geographically. You go from one country to the other, and you might have to rely on one trait more than the other. The nurturing style might be far more desired in one location, but if you do it in another location, you might be perceived as a weak leader. From a leader's point of view, as somebody had told me once, it is very lonely at the top. How do you keep check of that?
Well, I kind of got sucked into your example about cultural differences, and I wanted to share an experience when I first became so profoundly aware of how our culture shapes what we believe about what a good leader looks like. And I was doing some work with a Japanese multinational, and they had just implemented this new matrix structure. And their CEO was from the United States. And of course, all American companies have so many matrix reporting relationships that nobody knows who their boss is. And I had to interview the global leadership team, who's now has a new CEO who is from the United States. And I remember every one of them hated this matrix. But the reason why they hated it was because they believed that it caused conflict for their subordinates. And because for the American view was that a good leader would delegate, would allow somebody, if they had two bosses, to reconcile those conflicting views and would raise an issue. And so for the Japanese leader, that was just all of them believed that was an abdication of leadership, and that to give it to the subordinate to be responsible for resolving the role clarity was basically them not acting out as leaders. I loved that experience because it made me realize that what we believe about ourselves, that what's going to work and what's going to be effective, is very much shaped by who we are and where we grew up and what our own cultural background is.
Well, a lot of it is our own experiences that we bring to work, and we put it in business. I'm going to turn it over to Sam here in a second, but I was thinking about our session, so I had to look up crisis, which the whole world is in. Even though we feel it, we living it. I was wondering, where did the word crisis came from? And it's very, very interesting. The origins of the word are Greek. The word is krinein, and it means a decision. Now, I would never think of crisis as a decision, but when you think about it, it is a time of reckoning. You are making a lot of decisions, whether right, wrong, or different. And resilience is all about being able to rebound and come back. Put that together, it is what our session is all about. So talk a little bit about that. What is resilience, and how does it work in the organizations and individuals? If I may throw that to you, Corinne, please.
Yeah, I love that you've looked at the etymology of crisis, because I did a similar thing with resilience. I was working for a bank through the financial crisis, and started to get really interested in what resilience was and why we needed it. And that it literally does mean to leap back. And most of the original research on resilience is focused on survival. It's about getting through the adversity. So you can't have resilience without adversity. We have plenty of that right now. And that all that research around survival is helpful when we think about coping. And from a leadership point of view, it really does help us focus on ourselves and also our teams to get through and cope and build those coping strategies. But for organizations, that's not enough. And the other side of resilience is really about adapting for the future. So we think about the survival, surviving for today, and then thriving for tomorrow. So leaders and organizations need to balance, again, these two things, helping people get through today and cope with that adversity. You know, we are seeing demands on people just going up in so much from both a work context, additional work around COVID and managing COVID, customer needs, client needs, supplier impact, and at the same time, we're seeing home impact. This is a health crisis with financial implications, but it is a health crisis. And we're managing parents and we're managing kids, so there's an awful lot going on. But it's a great time to be experimenting and trying new things. And if I go back to our model of perform, transform, and energize, now is a time for transformation. I was wondering whether crisis actually would mean something to do with transformation, because there is such a strong element of the opportunity to transform. So organizations really, and we see this with many that we're working with, are thinking about what could they be doing differently? How can they be experimenting, co-creating with clients and customers solutions that are not only going to help them now, but going to help them in the future?
Our industry, coming back to hospitality, there are hundreds of thousands of people that are unfortunately out of jobs because the hotels have been shut down. Travel is virtually at a standstill. So from a leadership point of view, not only are they taking that weight on their shoulders of their colleagues not being there, they'd have to look after the businesses that are struggling to make any money. And that is intense amount of pressure. Sam, I'll send it over to you after this, but anything leaders can do to keep themselves grounded and not internalize this pressure, if you would. Alison, over to you for the response, please.
Wow. Well, Corinne's way more qualified to answer that question. But when I look at the leaders that I see doing this very well right now, I think one of the things that they're doing is engaging people around like a higher purpose. And in, for instance, I see in Marriott, for instance, here in the region, has done a really great job engaging their associates in thinking about feeding people in these tough times. And I think sometimes when we worry about other people, it helps us deal with our own anxieties. And I believe that is also important for organizations in times of hardship, is to think, so what's the big ask of us, and what is it that we can do? So I think that's probably the best example I have of how leaders can kind of not get so focused on their own anxieties and concerns, because they're huge.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. I think the purpose, if I think about hospitality, and it's not just the teams that are working within the hotels and the hotel industry themselves, it's the whole ecosystem around that are dependent on the tourism and the business that's brought. And we really see that as a real weight, especially, with hospitality leaders, taking it very seriously. Now, the upside of that, and we're seeing it in healthcare as well and other industries, is you have an amazing sense of purpose. It's really aligning for yourself and your teams, and it drives people together. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a purpose forever, but it could be a purpose for now. And that's a great way for leaders to focus themselves and their teams. The other thing I would help them think about is to make it okay to not be okay. And again, in the line that Alison was talking about, sometimes this is really hard for leaders. It's really hard to admit that they're going through a tough time too. And we talked about culture, but certainly in many places, the role of the leader is to be strong all the time, and that's what we do. And actually, that's not a resilient place to be. That's a very vulnerable place to be, because what we see with leaders often is they can go so far and then they'll just crack. So what a resilient place to be is to be able to know when you're not okay, to be able to understand what's going on emotionally, to have a strong support network around you, and to role model that for your people. And if you're role modeling it for your people, it gives you permission, gives you as a leader permission to also verbalize and articulate when you're having a good day, when things are tough. I was working with a group of leaders the other day, and I was talking about the fact that in our household, it's a Wednesday. Like, we just have a Wednesday. It's just not, for some reason, just since the pandemic, Wednesday's just not been a great day, and we kind of put each other through. It was amazing how many leaders in the conversation afterwards said, for us, it's a Thursday. For us, it's a Tuesday. But everybody was really recognizing this flow, this up and down, these days, and using that to help themselves and their teams manage.
As the wise person once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. If you think that things are bad today, they're bound to get worse tomorrow. So we got to be prepared for that. Sam, over to you.
Well, another wise man said, my life has been full of terrible misfortunes, but most of which never happened to me. Well, he was a wise man at his time. I have to say that I like the discussion, the way it's going, about looking at the Maslow hierarchy of needs, where a lot of companies, a lot of consultants they have done a great job in the past, they have a great track record, but they have no customers because the needs of the customers have changed. And I like the comment that you made about, Alison made a comment about, for instance, Marriott, where they are now looking at their their basic needs of a person. What are the really needs, and how can they help of reaching a customer much better and providing the help? And I see the companies are doing, in effect, they are startup companies that are growing out of here, where they're providing help rather than selling things for pleasure or selling for other things. But I want to just lead to another thing, Alison, because I noticed you're an endurance runner. Am I correct?
In the last few months, I have not been doing a lot of running, but yes, I do. I do triathlons and long distance running.
Well, I have I tried once because I want to feel how it feels to run a marathon. I practiced 6 months before that. But when I hit 30K, I was going through a wall, and I had a lot of negative thoughts. Can I make it? Why am I here? What am I doing this for? Can you relate this to how a leader has to deal with in what we call, maybe in that, when they're hitting that crisis situation, how can they get over to the other side and reach a goal that they actually don't know where the goal is, like we have now?
I love your question, because so the one thing I've learned about marathons is no matter how many times you've done, you get to that point and you're done. You're just so burned out. And no matter how fast or slow you go, you still also have it. So I think that kind of regardless of how well you train, you always have that period of time where it's very dark before the dawn. I know this sounds really strange, but I think that the first thing for leaders is to have a bit of self-compassion. I think what causes us to fail in a race is when we have this imperfect idea of who we have to be. And so to me, self-compassion is saying, oh my gosh, I feel terrible. I'm just going to kind of keep going, and I don't have to be perfect. So I do think that helps. But I will say, training the right way also helps a lot. And so having the right routines in place that can allow us to be endurance leaders is very important. Learning how to go fast, that's really important, because when you're training for any kind of race, If you always go slow and steady, you actually don't improve your body. So if you want to be a leader that has the capacity to endure and has the capacity to go in the long term, you have to build a routine of regularly pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. And that's that sweet sauce. That's that way that you grow and you change. If you're always comfortable, you're not changing. And then you're always going to phase out when you get to that 32-kilometer mark.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, Alison, I think that it's often that it may be the 32 kilometers, but then as you stretch and as you build your capacity, then you're going to be able to go further and further. It may be that you reach that point at the 5K earlier and in your running career. And so again, it's not just about in the moment, it's what are you doing to prepare? It's sticking with the analogy, how are you eating? How are you sleeping? How are you resting? How are you training? And then making sure that you are putting those routines in place that give you more capacity to go further. One thing we do see about leaders is that they may hit their wall at 32K because actually they're pretty resilient and they've done it a long time. What they didn't notice was that their people hit it at 5K. And they haven't really taken a note of or been in tune with their people to know that that's when they were hitting the wall. And we see that a lot because, many senior leaders have built strong resilience capability through their career. So again, when we coach leaders, we talk a lot about keeping your radar up to know what's going on with your teams and those around you.
Yeah, I mean, somebody said that you cannot commit to your dream and your comfort zone in the same time. So you have to be able to get out of that comfort zone in order to reach towards what your dream is. But what are some of the qualities in a leader now who are not coming from the endurance race or athletes, who are not athletes per se, who understands the mental aspects of training, sometimes through pain, to reach that maximum capacity that you talk about in your books and so on? What are some qualities that you see that the leadership can train themselves to endure these difficult times? Alison.
Well, I actually wanted to ask Corinne to talk about that because I think she has more depth of understanding of what the individual attributes of resilient leaders are.
Yeah, Corinne, over to you.
Happy to. And I think one thing learning doesn't have to be painful. Yes, it has to be a little bit uncomfortable and pushing, but, I think often pain is not necessarily a sign that we're learning. It's sometimes a sign that we've pushed ourselves too far. So, and resilient leaders actually are pretty good at knowing that. But what we do see with resilient leaders is we talked a little bit about the balance between who you are and what you do. And there is, again, quite a high proportion of personality characteristics that we see in resilient leaders. So they tend to be, it's about 60%, it's about 60-40% as a balance, the research shows us. So we see leaders being very calm. They're having high tolerance of ambiguity and uncertainty. So they're able to handle those situations. I always think of a resilient leader a little like a swan. Their feet are going underneath the water, but they're just smoothly on the top. And they're pretty good at structure. So they can structure things really well. Also, quite interestingly, they're optimistic. Optimism and positive attitude. It sounds a bit like a self-help book. When I start talking to leaders about it, they give me this wry smile. But the research shows that having a positive and optimistic outlook and attitude has a really large impact on how much we can sustain in our resilience. So certainly those would be some of the characteristics we'd see in resilient leaders. And that's great news because you as a leader can select for those characteristics into your team. If you're building a team of leaders amongst you can say, right, I want to integrate that into my hiring decisions. But you still have about 40% of resilience capability that you can develop and coach in people. So that's a big chunk. And that does come down to these practices. And we talk about 5 practices. We call them PACER. So certainly on brand with the endurance athlete and basically making sure that we're using the sports analogy. Personally, I am not an endurance athlete of any kind. So I think about it more of the mental race than the physical. If I'm on a horse, I'm fine. But our 5 PACER practices are purpose, and we've talked a lot about this, the importance of having a purpose and aligning people to that purpose, both for yourself It might be to do with how you're aligning with the organization, or it might be a bigger purpose. Why am I achieving this? We talked to organizations who were building healthcare technology early on in the pandemic to accelerate their hospital's ability to cope, and how important as a purpose that was to teams, and how that really helped drive experimentation. The second is about being adaptability. So really often that's around taking solutions that have worked in one place and scaling them into different places. Alison and I talk a lot about this. We always think about the old American TV show of MacGyver when we think about this practice. Anyone who can take a can and a pen and get out of a well. It's really about taking that practice and then using it in other places. It might be scaling a product from one market to others. The third one is control. So C is for control. And this is about separating what you can and can't control. So where you can control, putting control in place and structure, and where you can't, letting it go. And that is so hard, especially in the current context, because there is so much going on quickly, and that is an inside and outside of our control, both at home and at work. But certainly I see leaders write not to-do lists rather than just to-do lists to help them separate that control. The third is energy, and we've talked a bit about that. And yes, it is about eating well, sleeping well, resting well, and encouraging the team to do well. You can't pour from an empty cup, so you really do need to keep that energy well ready. And then the fifth is relationships, and I touched on this earlier, but certainly the importance of having that strong support network around you that helps you both emotionally to deal with what's going on and helps you solve problems, gives you perspectives. And we have a number of networks. For example, we have a CEO roundtable network of leaders across the world and across APAC, and they use each other to triangulate and get ideas. And the pandemic is a great example of that, just to see what's going on in different places and use that in their organizations.
Excellent. Well, I have to, there was something when you talked about the adaptability, and one of our viewers, Leif Tengström, he had been very kind enough to send a few remarks, and now I just read quote unquote. I don't want to stress the main content of Charles Darwin's work on the origin of species. The book is often misunderstood as some kind of a biological fascism. That is a popular misconception and totally wrong. And he continues with his survival of the fittest, which says that please keep in mind that those who will be successful in dealing with this immense problem of COVID-19 are those who are most able to adapt to this new environment, which is totally new and global, not necessarily the strongest, as someone maybe have commented earlier. So that's thank you, Leif Tengström, for taking the time on this. Any thoughts on this, Alison or Corinne?
Yeah, well, I love that comment, because I think a lot of times we think about resilience and we think about individual attributes. And my own perspective is really always about the organization culture, organization design. And I think that organizations that are successful in good times and bad, but particularly right now, show an amazing ability to be flexible and adaptable. And one of the things I'm reminded of is just, we talk about pivots. I've been thinking a lot about being able to pivot as an organization. And so what that means to me is to be very clear, what are our assets? What are our strengths? And then how can we focus really well and then pivot? And all the research shows that we don't want to pivot too much. We go too far away from our core capabilities and we're much more likely to fail. So we want to pivot quickly, and then we want to take action, and we want to learn quickly and then iterate. And so many organizations don't do this because they're used to, we spend 6 months putting together a plan, and then the next year we implement the plan. And I think that in a situation like we're in today, being adaptable means being much more able to implement small and also very large strategic changes quite nimbly.
I think a great example of this is the garment industry. So, this is an industry where it's been hugely impacted by COVID. And what I'm seeing there with some of the companies we're working with is they're changing their product mix pretty fast. So masks are a great example. They very quickly changed their product mix and looked at their sourcing and their supply strategy to say, okay, what do we need to be changing and what do we need to be selling? So there's just enough reinvention there that's going to help them expand and respond, but not too much that they're not using their core capabilities.
Yeah, I did an interview for a podcast that we co-produced with a local media company called MediaCore. And one of my favorite interviews was this guy who runs this gym. It's a chain of gyms. So during lockdown, nobody was going to the gym. And one of the things that he did was he had everybody was working from home, and his IT people started playing around and figuring out what would they do when people came back and they needed to have low density of people in the gym. So they built this app to manage the density of the floor. And they ended up realizing that they'd actually built a tool that they could sell into malls and retail stores that have the same problem. To me, that's a wonderful example of adaptability. Their core business is not building technology. But in fact, what they did is they used their knowledge of space and about how to manage the number of bodies in a gym to build a solution for them, which they were then able to monetize. It's a wonderful story of pivoting, but not too far.
Very good. Mm-hmm. Now, there's I'm sure a lot of the organizations, as they are thinking about how life will be after the pandemic. They're looking at the best case scenario, they're looking at the worst case scenario, they're making V-shape and all kinds of curves here. What is your advice to those organizations? Is it really wise to start to think in those extremes, or is it something where one should look in the middle and see that, hey, this could be maybe what I should consider now, and rather than trying to go to the worst case scenario or the best case scenario for my organization?
Well, our view is that you should absolutely consider the different scenarios and then make sure that you have a robust strategy so that you can increase the likelihood of success whichever scenario plays out. Because if we could predict the future, we wouldn't be here doing this. We'd be off running the world, right? Nobody can predict the future. And so what we have to do is imagine the unimaginable. We have to think about futures that, they might be nice, they might be bad. A colleague of mine has been doing some really great sort of post-COVID-19 scenarios, and they've created these two axes across life and livelihood. And if you really think about it, that's what every country, every society is dealing with is, do we want to protect life? Do we want to protect livelihood? And based on that, you have these very, very different scenarios that can come out. So I'm not necessarily a big fan of saying, great, bad, middle. I think we have to think of qualitatively different outcomes, and then we can start training and being ready so that we're looking out and looking ahead, and we say, I see that future seems to be unfolding. Now we go faster towards that.
Very good.
One of the things that we learned working with scenarios as well is that they really enable conversations that otherwise would not be palatable to happen. And so you can, we've worked with organizations where we put them in different rooms, which bring those scenarios to life and have them talk about that. And, they have visceral reactions to the ones that aren't necessarily supporting what they want the outcome to be. But the conversation afterwards is much broader. Yeah. And helps them get over that emotional reaction into, well, how does that need to affect our strategy? What do we need to be thinking? How do we build our talent there?
Yeah.
Okay, my last question before I hand over to Abid. Corinne, if there's one particular quality or the way a leader should be, if you would just give me one word, your favorite word about the leadership that you think is of utmost importance, that is not only about the time here and during the pandemic, before, after, during and after, but is actually holds true for the lifetime of an organization. Anything particular you want to think of?
Oh my goodness. One word?
Yes, only one. Okay, two, if you have to.
I think there are so many things leaders need to do, but at the core of it, I think leaders really need to be self-aware. They need to know what they are good at and what they are not, how they can change and adapt their own ability, and then be able to create teams and organizations around them that help them be successful. So if they don't have that ability to think about themselves and in a really humble and thoughtful way, then they miss an awful lot of opportunity to be the best leader they can be.
Yeah. Alison, anything you want to add to this?
I love that Corinne mentioned humility. I think that one of the most impactful articles I ever read was one. It was called "Why Should Anyone Be Led by You?" And I think sometimes when we think of leadership, it's all about me. What do I do, and how do I take care of myself? And I think that really great leaders try to be worthy of being followed.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, Alison, because in thinking about what leadership books we would potentially recommend, actually, Why Should Anyone Be Led by You was on my list. It's a great book that gives a really nice perspective on leadership.
Yeah. I want to give a final shout out to Mark Schaefer, who is a marketing strategist, and I read and I listen to him quite often. And he had this anecdote about the first job he had. And the president of the company had a sign on his table says, "Leaders dispense hope." And that holds so true, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, over to you, Abid.
Well, this is a fabulous conversation. And quite candidly, we got to keep track of time because it is late for you guys. So we'll make sure that we stay on schedule. We talked about operating in crisis and flexibility. I was having a plan and structure, but not so rigid. Isn't that a bit of a fine line, though, that if you're not sticking to a plan, it could be a total chaos or perceived chaos, whether it is or not? I mean, I can point a lot of different things that come to mind at this particular point where you almost see people flying by the seat of their pants rather than having a bit of a plan that can be adjusted as need be, particularly in the environment that we're in. Change has been in the organizations throughout, but today change is every single minute of the day. How do we align the goals? How do we align when we are making changes, and these changes might be at the very last second? How do we keep the staff together, particularly when you are not even together? So if I may throw that out to you, Alison, and then I'll come back to you, Corinne.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we know an awful lot about how to get alignment around goals. You know, organizations are anybody that is, I'm certain, that's listening on this call knows how to cascade goals down. I think the challenge is that when organizations are in a time like now where there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of need to be responsive, that the problem of alignment isn't up and down, it's across, and it's about different parts of the organization seeing and responding in different ways and needing to find that balance between, on one hand, wanting to go fast, and on the other hand, holding back so that they can get agreement on the critical few things that they need to drive together. So I think we've got to be thinking both about the horizontal and vertical alignment. But alignment always starts by having great clarity and focus. And that, I think, what happens when we're in times of crisis or ambiguity is there's a tendency for us to pull back our time horizon and to kind of really be focusing on, oh my gosh, what's going on right now? And so that's really a challenge for leaders, is to force the right time horizon. Because if we can't look up and out, we can't give our teams some visibility, some space to be able to get alignment and then be able to move forward.
Corinne, anything that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an element of constant communication. So if I think about resilience more broadly and keeping people well through change and organizations performing, there's a lot of balancing of resources and demand that's going on for the team. And when we work with leaders on that, we have an assessment that actually looks at the person characteristics of resilience, but also the environment around them, their position, what's happening in their resources and demands. And so constantly balancing that, like what are the kind of resources that they have to draw from, what are the demands on the team is really important. And if you're not communicating with your team, you don't have those structures in place to make sure the information is being cascaded or distributed, and you're not getting the input back again, it makes it very hard. And what we've seen is that those communication methods and cadences have had to shift very significantly for many, many leaders because of the way that we're working now, because we're not physically together, we're distributed, there's lots of other things going on. We thank goodness for technology. If it had been 5 years ago, I don't know what this would all look like, but that has had to look very different. And we've seen leaders structure spontaneity to make sure that they're having check-ins with their teams and those kind of conversations, ensuring that their team members are communicating with each other at the same time, so they don't escalate everything back up to the senior leader, and making sure that people are really clear on their priorities. And it might just be for the next few days, but they know where they're going and they're aligned on that.
Terrific. Are there best practices that you can share, or where technology might have helped better align the organization? Because everybody is spread out. Everybody during this crisis, you're not in one place where over a cup of coffee in the hallway you can at least have a small conversation. Are there best practices that you're able to share that might have helped organizations?
Well, our organization has, for over 15 years, has helped companies work more effectively in a distributed environment. And so one of the things that we've learned is that the best practice is not treating technology as a silver bullet and never think one size fits all. For instance, don't think that every meeting is good. Every problem can be resolved on a Zoom call, for instance. That you got to always match the affect and the affective bandwidth with the technological bandwidth. And so, for instance, if you have to do simple exchange of information, Messenger, WhatsApp, that's great. But if you need to co-create, you need a lot of bandwidth. You need new tools, you need new ways of thinking. And so I think this is something we've got to really think about in this kind of new normal, and that is that we need a lot of tools. And there's not just one. And we need to learn how to use them to solve the problems that we need. Lately, I've been hearing a lot of people talk about, digital leadership and digital transformation. And I'm like, yeah, okay, if we're saying that, we're already behind. Because what we need to worry about is leadership in a digital era, transformation in a digital era. So we need to learn how to solve problems using different types of technology that the situation demands. I think that is the number one best practice about working in a virtual, complex environment where, we don't necessarily come into an office and see people on a regular basis.
I feel like we're in this interesting little interlude where we, obviously COVID has accelerated digital technology hugely. Outside the business world, look at the classroom environment. We have had acceleration massively in what we can achieve in education. But at the moment, we're in a 2D electronic and digital world. And I don't think it's going to be very long with this acceleration and the new normal before we're back in a 3D world. I can imagine us sitting here in maybe 6 or 7 years, and actually it's much more like a physical interaction, because we're able to more likely be together as we were before. So I'm really interested to see whether everything will adapt for that and then adapt back, or whether that new world will look more like the 2D world. And again, I don't think we know yet. I'd be really interested in some of the scenarios that technology companies are building to see how they're developing new products.
Holographs are coming very fast, so we'll be able to interact. Relative to resilience, is it something you're born with, or is it something that you can develop? Corinne, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's definitely both. So don't worry if everything we have described, that is not me. I am not resilient at all. It's definitely that you can develop resilience. And to be honest, if you think about your career, every single one of us, if we think about our career, you've developed resilience. The things that you can cope with today, you would not have been able to cope with when you were a fresh grad. The things that you can cope with in 10 years' time that may be hugely difficult now, you'll be fine. And so we all build that capability and capacity. One of the leaders I was working with in a manufacturing company recently, and he said, you know, we thought closing the sites was going to be the difficult thing. That's what we thought. At the time, it was so tough. We had to close all the sites. We had to shut everything down. We had to send everyone home. He said, actually, that was the easy bit. Now, this is the difficult bit, because some are opening, some aren't. Some are then closing again, some aren't. We're having to manage different requirements and different needs. And what I said to him was, no, that was the difficult thing then. You just know how to cope with that now. And now you have a new challenge. So certainly I'd encourage everybody to think about how do they build their resilience and reflect. Write down, you know, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what have you learned, how have you stretched your capability so that you know how to use that in the future.
Terrific. Now, there must be some risks relative to resilience. What are those when people in the organization, even though resilient leaders are perceived to be more valuable to the organizations, but how do I communicate, or how do I exhibit that I'm a resilient leader? But what are the risks of being a resilient leader? Is it that I'll stop learning because I am resilient and I don't need to learn anymore? This is how we've done things. Corinne, any thoughts?
I love your question. This is like my favorite question of all time. And I never really talk about this, but yes, you can be too resilient. Absolutely, 100%. And what happens when we find people that are too resilient is they're very, very self-confident. And sometimes a little arrogant, because they believe in their own ability to succeed and be right and get things done, and that nothing's really phasing them too much. And what we see from research and from practice in organizations is that can impact people's trust of that leader, because they never listen. They don't feel like they're engaged with the person, and they don't feel like they are taking their opinion. Very, very resilient leaders also tend to not necessarily have any sense of urgency or panic. So they come across super calm. And again, that can impact how people see them, because they never show any sense of urgency or any indication that they care or are worried. So often I coach leaders to maybe show a little bit more of that, because again, that can impact how people are perceiving them. And then lastly, really resilient leaders, I think I mentioned this earlier, they tend not to pick up on the signals of their teams who may be less resilient. And so they can burn their teams out really easily because they just haven't been able to pick up on the needs of the groups that they're leading and working with.
And that, sorry, go ahead, Alison.
Well, I was just going to say, we did some research recently. We found that about 16% of leaders kind of fell into that category. So it's not like everybody. It is a subgroup that would be maybe too resilient.
Okay. The challenge in leadership has always been just staying aware of your teams and surrounds, and that's easier said than done. Quite candidly, it is possibly the toughest thing. My best job with the least amount of pressure was when I was a trainee at Windows in the World in New York City, which unfortunately doesn't even exist. You went in, you clocked in, you did your thing, and you walked out. Life was fabulous. And as you grew in the organization, things got more and more and more complicated and complex. We have approached the hour. Sam, are there any other questions that we might have? Or as much as I would hate to, I wouldn't want to keep these ladies any longer because we have approached the hour.
Thank you, Abid. No, I think there has been a very good fluid conversation, and I don't see any specific question that came up. We have viewers watching from Europe and United States, one particular from Florida. So they're just sending greetings and awesome and thumbs up. That's what we're getting. So I think, ladies, you have really provided a lot of good value in this conversation. So I think we are good for this episode.
Superb. Great. So some general questions for you. And Alison, I'll ask you first. a leader that you get your inspiration from? Anybody comes to mind?
Well, there's a leader that I actually sits on our advisory board, Joachim Ackerman. He sits on our advisory board, and he's ex-Google tech leader, and he's been helping me because I'm leading my business through the biggest transformation that we've had in 20 years. And so what I observe in him is this amazing ability to simplify incredibly complex problems, to find the best in people, to help people be curious, to hold people accountable, and yet to give freedom. So I personally, as a CEO, I don't have a boss. And so I just over the last year have really appreciated him as a mentor to me. And I see that people like you, that you've been the CEO of a company, and you know that how hard that is, right? That you have that opportunity also to mentor and impact others. So that's had a huge impact on me. Fabulous.
Corinne, for anybody that comes to mind?
Is it really super cheesy to say Alison?
It's very cheesy. You can't say that.
A big shout out to Alison.
I do. I mean, also, I echo what Alison said. I mean, I work with some amazing leaders, and I have the privilege to coach some incredible leaders doing such interesting and varied jobs, and they care about their people and they want to do a great job, and I learn from them all the time. And that's one thing that I just love about my job. So I certainly am inspired by lots of the people we work with around the world.
Terrific. So, Corinne, for you this time, a decision that you wish you hadn't made.
Oh, this was so hard because I tried to find something that was really work related. And I think one of those things is most decisions you've made have led to other decisions or consequences that actually you wouldn't roll back. But on a really personal note, I chose not to take my family to Lapland last year to see Santa. My daughter's 8 now. And now I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that. And I regret that. And that's taught me that I need to take advantage of things and do them, because you never quite know what's around the corner.
That is very hard to remember, but we do have to remind ourselves of that. My wife reminds me of that all the time, but I'm still guilty of that. Alison, any decision that you wish you hadn't made?
No, I tend not to regret making or not making decisions. I mean, I have similar choices that I've made where I look back, I wish I'd spent more time with my mom and dad when they were alive. Those are the things that I regret. Yeah, I can't think of anything that I'd say, I wish I hadn't made that decision.
Well, I'm very happy that neither one of you said that we regret coming on this episode. So, well, we're good at that. So, Alison, back to you. A book that you would recommend relative to leadership development. Everybody might have a bit of time and a little stress. So if I was to pick a book to improve my own resilience and reduce stress, what would you recommend?
Well, I hope they'll read my book, Pacing for Growth, because there's a huge theme in Pacing for Growth. It's Pacing for Growth, Why Intelligent Restraint creates long-term success. I used my experience as an endurance athlete to describe how you can build capacity for growth. And a very important element of it is about one of these rules. I have a concept called intelligent restraint, which is about pushing yourself to go as fast and far as you can, but then no further without the capacity to sustain it. And one of my rules of intelligent restraint is exert, then recover. And so often we exert to the point where we burn out, but that doesn't make us better. And we can't keep developing and learning if we don't do that. So we have to learn that relationship between exert and then recover. So I actually, in the book, I list out a number of the PACER practices. I had forgotten about that until Corinne started talking about the PACER model. And you know what? If anyone's listening to this and you are currently unemployed and you're thinking, I don't want to buy your book, you write to me and I will send you a electronic copy, or I'll give you a copy of the book. And I hope it'll help you and inspire you.
That is very kind, and we will put that in the notes on our YouTube channel so that people would know. That would help a great deal. By the way, is the book available on Amazon? It's as easy as...
Yeah, you can just Google it. It's on Amazon. There's an e-version and a soft copy.
Fabulous. Corinne, a book that you would recommend?
Sure. I mean, I tend to like books that are on specific pieces of leadership. So I like Sheila Heen's Difficult Conversations and Atomic Habits by James Clear. I think the leadership books that have probably had the biggest impact on me personally, one is Why Should Anyone Be Led by You by Goffey and Jones. I think it's a really interesting book. It's kind of old, but it's a goodie. And the other one, which is super old, and is Defining Moments by Joseph Badaracco. And that's always had a profound impact on me. And I think especially now, thinking about what are those moments in our life and our career that define us, and what does that say about us, the kind of leader we are, the kind of leader we want to be. It's a really important thing to be thinking about. So those would be my recommendations.
Superb. Well, thank you. That was a great conversation. You know, it is really, really, really important, particularly in the midst of crisis, as we've talked about for the last hour, that we continue to learn and we continue to make sure that it is not just us that are going through this. There are lots of people, unfortunately, all around the world that are going through it. So your feedback and your input has been fabulous. Sam and I always end our episodes with a feel-good story. So, Alison, to you first.
A feel-good story about myself, or just a feel-good story of an experience?
An experience about yourself, about hospitality industry, or something that you might have learned about yourself during this quarantine.
I have this wonderful experience that I can share. It's such a feel-good thing. I was doing some work. There's a luxury hotel chain that we do work with. And the leader was wanted to drive more innovation with his organization. So we did some work with the top 30 leaders of the region, and I just still have this wonderful moment of remembering we did this design challenge, and we had teams of these leaders designing experiences that were really innovative and very different. And because in their world, they're always so refined and so dignified. And so to see them together, having so much fun together and really being very creative and thinking differently. And we even had an architect come in as an external, one of the judges. And we just had so much fun together. And so I think the feel good for me was just that reminder that when we create, when we design, it comes with joy, right? And so if we want to help, if we want to be more creative, we got to find those moments where we laugh and we are joyful. So that really makes me smile.
Superb. Corinne.
I'm going to stay on theme with resilience, because I think one thing that's important for me is that resilience is a team sport, and it really is about building resilience in the community. And I think the two examples of that have just made me smile and cry a little bit over the past few months has been in Singapore. Here we have very quickly seen a whole Facebook group set up as circuit breaker hit for restaurants all around the island who were impacted terribly, through from tiny little restaurants through to hotels with the restaurants as part of them, and enabling people to advertise and also to go to these different restaurants and have takeaway from them. And the Facebook group went from, I think it was like 10 people to 25,000 people within a week, and that's saved people's livelihoods. And I think that's fabulous. And a similar thing has happened in the performance industry, and the collaborations and the caring and the support that I've seen between performers who have been so impacted by this has really blown me away. And so those are when I'm doom scrolling through my Facebook and I put it aside and I think must stop doom scrolling, those are the things that remind me that, change is sometimes a really positive thing. And yeah, it's a tough time right now, but there are good things that are coming out of this too.
We will definitely look forward to the better times ahead, because they are definitely going to be back, and particularly for travel and tourism industry, it is innate in human beings to want to travel. So we look forward to those times. Alison, thank you so much. Corinne, fabulous conversation. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you to all of our viewers, whether you joined us on Facebook, YouTube, or LinkedIn. Hope you enjoyed this conversation with two wonderful, wonderful panelists. The recorded version will be on our channel on YouTube. Over to you, Sam.
Yes, also from Helsinki, I'd like to thank all the viewers, all the replay viewers, and a special message to Corinne. Lapland is waiting for you, so we'd like to see you up here, and just let me know. I'll be glad to show you what the beautiful landscape and the nature you can provide when you go to a place which has unspoiled air and it's constantly fresh. So I hope to see you there. And same goes for you, Alison. If you make your way up here to Helsinki, we'd love to see you here. So
thank you.
So with these few words, then we just close this episode. It's been a great discussion, and we are looking forward to welcome you to the next episode. Again, we have scheduled several. If you follow us on YouTube, you will see on the events that has been scheduled. Abid has been very busy drumming up great panels for this, and also you will see those announcements coming up in Facebook when Facebook allows it, which is usually 7 days in advance. And same goes for LinkedIn. You will be able to see the announcement for the upcoming episode. So we're looking forward to welcome you, and we'll see you next time again.